Great, thanks Haley, and welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about the private 5G market today and how that market's developing, so let's jump right into it. That's me. My email's there. If you want to email me, feel free to do so. If you want a copy of the slides, you can email webinars@tbri.com or you can download it straight from the console. We're not automatically sending out the slides, so if you want them, you have to get them in one of those two ways. Before we jump in, this is a list of the syndicated reports that TBR's telecom group puts out. TBR covers the entirety of the ICT ecosystem. I just represent the telecom portion of that, and these are the reports under that umbrella. And the report in blue there, the private cellular networks market forecast, that's the report we're going to be sharing the key findings from today. But we also cover a variety of other areas within the global telecom industry, including, but not limited to 5G. On the public network side, we cover edge compute, the hyperscalers. We cover the public sector aspect of the telcos. We cover a variety of tier one operators and vendors from across the globe. So before we jump into the material, I want to share the taxonomy we're using before we start showing data and looking at that. So private cellular network. So this is how we define it. It's a non-CSP entity such as a business or a government agency that's procuring, owning, and controlling, but they may or may not operate the PCN infrastructure. The network resources are typically consumed internally. There is a semblance of control and full visibility into the traffic that's running over that PCN. These tend to be, but don't have to be, self-sufficient environments. They may or may not interface with the public network. What we're capturing in the data is just the private aspect, the parts that the telco does not own is what we're covering in this data set. So for example, a manufacturing company that's buying a private network solution and putting it in a factory, that would be falling under this taxonomy. If a CSP leases spectrum to a non-CSP entity, we consider that PCN if the non-CSP entity is buying the infrastructure. So the spectrum is agnostic to how we're looking at the market. What really comes down to is who is the buyer of the infrastructure? Are they buying that from a telco? Are they buying that from a OEM? Are they buying that from a hyperscaler? Is it being resold? In the case of a telco, is it being resold to them? Or is it being provided over public infrastructure? These are all considerations that go into our parsing of public versus private and how we size the market. If a telco is providing value-added services, such as managed services, to support a non-CSP entity-owned PCN, we are including that revenue in the market size. So just for the managed services portion. Okay, more clarifications, because there's a lot of gray area. We're trying to delineate public versus private as best as we can. And we do acknowledge there is gray area in the formulation of this. So the ownership of the infrastructure has to be by a non-CSP entity. We're including the RAN, the core, the transport layer, and the services, the full life cycle of services for that infrastructure in the market sizing we're going to be showing. We are including variants of LTE and 5G. So things like ELTE would be included in the total PCN market size we're going to be showing. Even though it is not fully aligned with 3GPP, it is mostly aligned with 3GPP, and therefore we are going to include it. We are not including legacy like GSMR, Tetra, P25, we're not including any of that in the market size. It's strictly, in one graph we're going to show it's going to be LTE and 5G, and then we're just going to be showing 5G for the rest of the data set. We do not include spectrum acquisition and leasing costs in the market size. We're trying to isolate infrastructure and infrastructure services. That's the objective for my team, how we're trying to look at this market. We also do not include endpoint devices. It's strictly infrastructure we're looking at. We are looking at IT and OT and the convergence of those. That is a key component of the wanting to use 5G because it can bridge that and bring business outcomes from transforming IT and OT. We talked about procurement. The procurement can be from a number of types of providers. It could be a telco or a cable co. It could be a hyperscaler. It could be what we call a network solution provider, which is an OEM, an ODM, companies like that. It could be a pure play software company for certain types of things like an ASINet providing a mission critical mobile core. They would be considered an NSP under this. And then we're also including IT solution providers like the Dells, the HPEs, the Lenovo's, as well as the GSIs and the consultancies. All of those companies have a key role to play in the private cellular networks market. Network slices are not included in this market size. We consider network slices to be public, coming from a public network where you're splicing, partitioning network resources from a public network core to provide those solutions. And if there's a hybrid implementation where it's part public, part private, we're trying our best to isolate just the public, just the private part of that overall usage of the network. So for example, if there is a transportation company that uses a private network in their hubs, but then once those trucks leave the hub, they connect to a public network, we are only including the infrastructure paid for by the company that they own and control in that hybrid network environment. Okay, so this is a list of typical locations and environments where you'll see private networks deployed. I'm not going to go over all these, but these are very common areas to find a private network, a private cellular network, especially. As we know, private networks includes wireless and fixed access mediums. And on the wireless side, it's 5G, it's LTE, it's all the legacy technologies like GSMR, and it's also Wi-Fi. And we will be talking a little bit about Wi-Fi in coming slides. Okay, so key findings. The pace of the market development for 5G is slowing. It's being more gradual than we originally anticipated. And we attribute this primarily to continued issues on the supply side. We are expecting broad scale to occur, but the timing of that scale is being delayed, being pushed into the second half of this decade is when we think the 5G market is now going to become broadly proliferating. And there's reasons for that, why we've changed those assumptions. I'm going to talk about some of those. On the supply side, there is a variety of issues that are happening at the same time. One is the specifications are being delayed. Since COVID, Release 16, Release 17 have both suffered delays. There are key features in those specifications, especially for B2B, that were delayed. And once those things get delayed, it pushes out the commercialization of those features. And if you're an enterprise that's looking for something like TSN to run ultra low latency robots in a factory setting, that's pushing out those timelines. Those roadmaps are being pushed out. There's also problems on the device side, sensors, chipsets, specifically advanced chipsets, many of which come out of one country. There are lead times that have widened. There is complexity in those advanced chipsets that are delaying them from becoming commercially available. There is parts delays in certain parts of the supply chain where you might be missing one component and you can't sell the box because you're missing a part, a key part. And in some cases, there's only a few suppliers or one supplier that is able to provide that very specialized part. We still see some of that, even though a lot of those challenges have been getting better in aggregate. But there are still pockets of that, especially where there's still lockdowns happening in a key country that provides a lot of those parts. That is a topic that's going to be a persistent challenge in this market. The ROI is also a challenge. A lot of the 5G activity to date, I would characterize as experimentation and small-scale commercial deployments. We are not seeing large-scale deployments yet. And I think that a key reason for that is a lot of these supply chain issues we're talking about, but it's also the ROI. Enterprises still want to see a clear line of sight to justify the investment in the technology. A lot of the activity we've seen today is driven by government stimulus that is making the ROI work. It's driving research, it's driving some commercial implementations, especially in Europe. There's a bunch of examples of this happening. And that is not at scale yet. So experimentation, small scale commercial deployments, we're still waiting to see scale here, broad scale. Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is still very relevant and it should not be underestimated. Wi-Fi 6 has legs for the private networks domain, and we are going to see Wi-Fi continue to play a key role in the entirety of the private networks market. Wi-Fi 6 has some new features that are important, some of which are similar to the types of features you'd see in 5G. Wi-Fi is broadly deployed already globally in enterprise environments, and there is some desire among enterprises to stick with Wi-Fi wherever possible and not have to introduce a new access medium to run network environments, especially when we think about the convergence of IT and OT. You don't want to add complexity to that. So yeah, you can run 5G and Wi-Fi in the same environment, but it's more seamless. It's likely more seamless if you stick with one access medium that the IT department already understands, rather than introducing something new that is, first off, more expensive, and second off, is different in how it needs to be dealt with. There's other reasons Wi-Fi has staying power as well. We are going to see situations where enterprises make a choice, make a strategic long-term choice to walk down a path with a primary technology medium. And I think Wi-Fi still has a lot of staying power, especially in certain types of verticals like retail. I think we're going to see Wi-Fi remain pervasive and leveraged for new use cases that you might otherwise have seen private cellular technologies used for. So something to keep an eye on. And then last but not least, the hyperscalers. We have to talk about them because they're serious players. They are serious about private networks, especially 5G. And we are going to see some very significant market disruption. All three of the primary hyperscalers have private 5G strategies in place, and we are expecting those to broadly grow in scope as we move forward. Okay, let's look at some market sizes. So this is our total private 5G infrastructure spend. This is global. It's still growing quite well. The CAGR is in a solid double-digit, high double-digit rate. Very attractive market opportunity, even though we've reduced, or rather pushed out the scaling of it. It's still very attractive. Some of the growth drivers are deglobalization. So think about friendshoring and nearshoring and regional source shoring. These are new buzzwords in the supply chain ecosystem. Basically, what this means is new factories are going to be built. In many cases, those new factories are going to use technologies such as 5G and MEC and AI/ML and other technologies of that nature to build world-class next-generation facilities. Think about the chip foundries that are being built in the States. Early days on that, but I mean, if you think about advanced assembly lines and how you could use these technologies in greenfield environments, those are going to be key catalyst situations for driving spend on private 5G. Industry 4.0 is going to be a broad thing. Large enterprises are fixated on this. They have the money to spend. If the ROI is there, if they can see the justification, the money materializes. That's what we see. That's what we have seen in prior tech cycles. Even in a recessionary environment, enterprises will spend if they see an outcome that will justify that spend, especially if it has to do with cost reduction. Like that is a top of mind thing for enterprises. Fresh spectrum and government stimulus are also key drivers. There's new spectrum coming in other markets. There's more bands in markets that already had spectrum available for enterprise use. There's shared bands out there like CBRS. There's the 6 gigahertz band, which has tremendous promise. There's a lot of spectrum movement going on, all of which is pointing favorably to the build out of the private network opportunity. So on the detractor side, we've talked about delays, we talked about the chips, the complexity. There's still the COVID impact, especially in certain countries. There is this impending global economic recession, which we're seeing that in the economic data. I just saw the PMIs, the ISM data over the past 2 weeks. I mean, manufacturing activity is clearly slowing down in all of the major regions. There's other economic indicators too. Basically, we're probably going to be in a broad recession next year, and potentially even this quarter on an official basis. Another detractor is restructurings, bankruptcies, and consolidation. As the economy weakens, we are going to see marginal players and financially weak players get subsumed by stronger entities. We're also going to see restructurings and rounds of consolidation across the major verticals, and this will slow investment. If you're in an M&A situation or restructuring situation, priorities are different. If you're a stronger entity, your priorities will more look like focused on the outcomes and running the business as you have been, but running it more efficiently. Those are the enterprises that we're going to see push forward with investment in next generation tech, even during the recession. We've got geopolitics, which feeds into the supply chain and deglobalization trends. The skilled resource shortages We all know about the shortage of people that understand the new technologies, that understand how to bridge IT and OT, that understand edge computing and how that can be made useful to drive business outcomes. That's a big challenge, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. Spectrum allocation delays. Some countries are delaying spectrum. There's been some uncertainty about spectrum in places like India, how spectrum policy is going to be shaped. Those things delay market development. And then last but not least, we have Wi-Fi incumbency is something private 5G is going to be running up against, especially against Wi-Fi 6. So basically what we did is we leveraged these points, the drivers and detractors, against our other data that we collect, and we factor in all of these things in the formulation of the market size. Okay, so we showed 5G, now we're showing the LTE and 5G. So this is private LTE and private 5G total spend. And the light green bar there is the private LTE part. So we did take this down, the size of the market, and we had to push things out for the reasons we talked about. LTE has some staying power. We're seeing some vendors prioritize LTE with their customers with a seamless migration path to 5G. So you might see things like 4.9G, things of that nature, or LTE Advanced. There's different ways that it's marketed. Basically, the way we read that is it's a seamless migration path, a stepping stone, if you will, from LTE to 5G, but it's not technically 5G yet. Over time, we will see migration from LTE to 5G for customers that are currently running LTE environments, but those timings are being delayed by the problems that we're seeing. Okay, so I want to talk about the evolution of the market size and how much we had to push it out. So what I did is looked at 4 different market sizes we've done over the last 2.5 years or so for the private 5G market size. And this is showing our evolution of our curves. So the lightest green going to black there, the lighter it is, the older that data set is. The darker the line, the more current the data set is. And the black one is our most current market size. So what you can see there is a push out of the spend. It's a delay. So all those delays and problems we talked about is characterized, is basically depicted in this graph. Demand is still there, but the timing of actual revenue being transacted for infrastructure deployment is being pushed out. Okay, so we are seeing 2 distinct phases of the private 5G market. This is what we are expecting. So I'm giving you an extra 5 years here of market deployment. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball, but based on what we've seen in the LTE cycle, what we're seeing in the demand environment, what we're seeing on the supply side, what we're seeing among the different vendor constituencies, and what enterprises are saying helps us to make a market size projecting out to the end of this decade. And basically what we are seeing is we're going to see scale in the second half of this decade. But there's 2 distinct phases en route to 2030. Phase 1 is going to be what we characterize as a 5G transition. So this is, 5G is not really ready yet for enterprise. We're seeing a lot of LTE still out there. This is the experimentation and small scale commercialization phase, would be 2020 to 2025. NSPs and SIs dominate this market. It is not the telcos. This is, the telcos are a minor player in the way we cover private networks. It is predominantly NSP and SIs that are driving this market. Governments are heavily stimulating phase one. We don't have enough time to talk about the stimulus programs that are out there, but there are many. There are many different initiatives underway. Even the CHIPS Act in the States indirectly drives the private 5G market. On the Open RAN side, there's some money in that bill that's dedicated to Open RAN and driving forward 5G. And then there's also an implication to the chipsets and regionalization of that supply chain. These are very important for building out the 5G ecosystem. And that's just one example. There are many other examples. In the first phase, private 5G solutions are highly customized and they require significant systems integration to deliver outcomes. That's what we're seeing now. 5G compatible endpoint devices are gradually becoming available and hyperscalers are experimenting with private 5G. That's a key word, experimenting, because when we move to phase two, we are expecting the hyperscalers to become the dominant purveyors of private 5G solutions. And we are expecting them to be tightly aligned with the clouds. So we believe network resources are a natural evolution of cloud services, and that the convergence of cloud and networking and the convergence of IT and OT are right in the crosshairs of where the hyperscalers are moving to. So they are right in that sweet spot. It's going to take some time for them to figure it out and to scale, but we do believe they will get there, and the opportunity for them is very, very significant for growth. And they're going to be driving that activity inside of their ecosystems, platforms, and marketplaces. We're also going to see hyperscalers bring MEC and AI/ML into private 5G, tightly integrated stacks with partners and first-party solutions. We're going to see a mix of all of that. We're already seeing some of this. If you look at the strategies that have been outlined to date, those are the first step, the first inning, if you will. When we think forward where that might go, we're expecting that to become very, very broad and disruptive. We're expecting 5G to become standardized and easier to consume at scale. We're expecting XaaS models for private 5G to become pervasive. Telcos are not really using XaaS models, but enterprises are very comfortable with XaaS. I mean, they use it extensively across their organizations today, mostly in the IT side, but they will embrace it on the connectivity side as well, because those IT departments are already very well accustomed to consuming resources in that way. And last but not least, enterprises are going to realize significant business outcomes by leveraging private 5G at scale. So think about cost reduction, new revenue generation, those types of outcomes would be what we would expect enterprises to start to realize at a large scope in the second half of this decade. Okay, and this is just saying the hyperscalers are going to become very important players in this market. All right, so now what we're doing is breaking out private 5G opportunity by provider type. So we've got telco, cable co, hyperscale, NSP, and IT solution providers. The network solution providers and the IT solution providers drive the bulk of the market today, and that will remain the case through mid-decade. Most of the volume, money that's being transacted, is flowing through those entities, primarily directly through those entities, as well as through channel partners. So that is the primary way that this is happening. Telco, yeah, there's some. Remember, we're excluding spectrum, situations where spectrum is being sublet to an enterprise. This is, from a resale and a value-added service perspective, yes, some telcos are generating money from this. But if you look at the globe and, you know, at a high level, what's going on, it's a relatively small component of the of how the money is actually being filtering through this market. We're breaking the market now by customer size. The best way we could think of to do this was by employees. And basically, large companies are going to be the vast majority of spend on this private 5G. And if we even broke that further into large and mega entities would be Global 2000 size enterprises in government agencies. That mega category is going to be around half of the entire market opportunity. So, I mean, we see extreme concentration of spend pools that are going to materialize in this market, where you have companies like John Deere or Ford that are spending many millions of dollars, each of them, on private infrastructure. And the aggregate spend, just because of the scope of those companies, those types of Global 2000 sized entities, is so significant that it'll move the needle for the entirety of the market. Early days right now, but if you look at what people at Ford and John Deere and other companies have said publicly about where they see this stuff going, it is reasonable to assume that we're going to see significant spend on this type of a technology. And it's going to be a private, we're going to see a lot of private networks be deployed by those types of entities. Small and medium, I think it needs to become easier to consume. Yes, there's companies like Cradlepoint out there, which is owned by Ericsson, but the reality is small entities, which are less than 1,000 employees, spend on private 5G is going to be relatively small. And we don't see that materially changing. When the hyperscalers and the broader industry makes private 5G, the cost points come down. And I think that the ROI is more realizable at a smaller scale, right-sized essentially for SMEs. I think you're going to see more adoption of private 5G networks, but we're not there yet. Okay, from a vertical standpoint, the major verticals that we've identified are manufacturing, transport and logistics, natural resources, government, and other verticals. Other verticals is predominantly retail, healthcare, entertainment, and hospitality, and utilities. Those are the primaries in there. The bulk of the spend is government and manufacturing. But there is also significant spend in the transport and logistics and natural resources side. Over time, we're expecting other verticals to adopt private 5G in various levels, but we're also expecting Wi-Fi to stay strong in those verticals. So it's really going to depend. We're also going to see LTE have some staying power. A lot of utility companies out there that are using private LTE today, those networks are working fine for their needs, like smart meters and things like that. They don't really need 5G, at least not anytime soon. So those things need to be considered. They already have LTE out there in many cases. If they were already going to adopt it, it's already out in the field. It's operationalized. What's the justification to upgrade all of that? You know, those timelines, those roadmaps are going to be out of ways. And then from a regional perspective, Asia-Pac is driving the bulk of global spend. China, Japan, South Korea, those types of countries there's a lot of private networks activity going on in all of those countries. Australia, New Zealand, over time, there'll be some contribution there. You know, Singapore, there's a variety of Asia-Pac countries that are going to be driving private 5G adoption. When we look outside of APAC, North America is going to be also growing quite rapidly. It's mostly going to be the States. Canada is a little bit slower to adopt relative to the States. So we're going to see some leadership among enterprises in the States, especially those companies that are part of the global Fortune 2000 companies. CALA and EMEA is a mixed picture. In CALA, most of the investment, what we're seeing today is it's natural resources companies that are driving that. So think mining, oil and gas, and agriculture. Those types of entities are driving private 5G investment today. And then in EMEA, Europe, there's quite a bit of deployment already across verticals. And then in EMEA, it's more limited. In the Middle East, as you would expect, oil and gas, some of them are adopting private 5G. And then also for public safety, there's some examples of that. In Africa, it's very early days for private networks in general, private cellular networks in general. Okay, so key takeaways, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So I just want to reiterate the key points from earlier in the deck. So the private 5G market is developing gradually, more gradually than we were anticipating, and it's predominantly due to supply side issues. And we talked about what some of those are. The 5G opportunity is still going to be significant, and it will ultimately scale. The question is, when is that scale phase going to happen? And as we showed in that two-phase chart, we're expecting the second half of this decade where we're going to see significant scale in this market across verticals and across all of the key countries. And last but not least, we are going to see the hyperscalers become very significant players in this market. It's early days right now, and there have been some stumbles, but the path for them to disrupt this market is very clear. If you look at the cloud businesses and if you look at the platforms that they have and where they would be going with those things as they evolve, something like private 5G is very much critical for that picture. So we do expect that's going to happen. Okay, so with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to go right down the list here. If you have a question, put it in the chat box, and we'll get through as many as we can. So the first question is, the healthcare vertical, is it not big enough to be called out? So healthcare has some challenges of its own that are vertical specific. So there's regulation, there is data residency, data compliance challenges. Think about HIPAA in the States. There is liability that has to be considered. Is that 5G connected smart something that's keeping someone alive actually going to work? And what's the risk of it potentially not working? What's the liability involved? I mean, these are key questions that have to be figured out before we're going to see any semblance of scale. Ultimately, these things I think will happen. The market will evolve, but when you start thinking about regulations and how fast regulations evolve, it's slow. So healthcare we do not expect it to be a leading vertical for private 5G networks. There's also some concern about signaling in healthcare environments where it may interfere with diagnostic equipment. That is not, to my knowledge, it hasn't been proven. But it is a concern that will need to be, proven one way or the other. So what I mean by that is there is some concern in the industry that using things like millimeter wave spectrum in a healthcare environment could interfere with, diagnostic equipment that's being used in the hospital. So things like that, whether it's true or not, these are things that need to get figured out before we're going to see a broader adoption. I think we'll see some experimentation in healthcare, and I think we're seeing some of that today. But in terms of having that become a significant vertical, we're still a few years away from that. The next question is, can Wi-Fi support both IT and OT for many of the verticals private 5G is intended for, i.e. security and reliability of performance. So Wi-Fi 6 needs to be looked at much more closely because there are some key enhancements in that specification set that address some of the shortcomings that Wi-Fi has traditionally had. And it opens the door to consider using Wi-Fi as a future-proof connectivity platform for bridging IT and OT. So my recommendation would be that people should take a close look at Wi-Fi 6 and the potential that might have to compete against private 5G. The next question is, Wi-Fi 6 and 7 are gaining ground with cost efficiencies and some of the characteristics of 5G. How do you see that market share compared to 5G for enterprise? So Wi-Fi, if you look at private networks holistically today, if you consider all access mediums, so fixed and wireless, all of the legacy, all of the new stuff, all of the iterations of Wi-Fi, if you look at that pie chart, Wi-Fi is a very large slice. Wi-Fi is broadly used across verticals globally, and it's already entrenched in many business environments and government entity environments. So I don't have like an exact percent off the top of my head, but I know that the slice is much larger than the cellular slices, like maybe 10 times larger than the slice of cellular. So we're talking about a very significant entrenched base that Wi-Fi already has in IT and OT environments for enterprise and government. So that needs to be factored in here. And that's exactly what we're doing in the comments we're making here. But yeah, Wi-Fi, it's significant. It's a large slice of that pie. The next question is, what is the industry doing to educate and prepare the industry for 5G, which has been demonized by conspiracists and others? What should the industry do to educate the public and the workforce about 5G? So, yeah, I mean, there's been some of that, and that's been in the news, but by and large, I think that's a very small minority of people that think those things about 5G. I think that if people understand that technology evolves and that technology changes. I mean, they can just look at their computer or their phone to see how technology changes over time. And when new things are introduced, there's usually some pushback. But ultimately, there's an embracing of the new technology, and people wind up actually liking it. It makes their lives easier. It brings them outcomes that they weren't expecting that are positive things. I think that 5G will be no different. And I think that once businesses and consumers start to see real benefits in their situations from these new technologies, I think that these are going to be, these are going to be just non-issues or very small considerations. So in terms of educating the public, I think that as people actually use the technology, I think that's going to alleviate a lot of these concerns because they're going to realize that, it's an evolution of how they've been interfacing with technology, and I would expect that to become the mainstream ideology. All right, I think, okay, more questions. The next question is, do you think geopolitics will have any impact on hyperscale market share, or is it more of a NAS, network service provider issue only? So, I think it depends on what you mean by geopolitics in this context. If you're talking about the regulatory environment, we could have a whole hour discussion just about that. but my high level response to that would be the countries that are pushing back hardest against the hyperscalers are also the countries that need them the most. And the reason they need them is because those countries are falling behind in digital transformation and in economic productivity, and they need investment. They need infrastructure investment. They need to innovate. They need to evolve. And there is a real risk of those things falling even further behind for countries or groups of countries that determine that they don't want to participate in that and they want to go their own way. I think long term that's going to be very problematic. And I think we're going to see some breakthroughs in terms of how the different stakeholders work together for a joint good. And yeah, there's going to be, nothing is going to be perfect. No system is perfect. There's going to be problems. But I think that the cost of doing it the way that people are messaging it, how they want things done, and the reality of if that were to happen, the challenges of that would be far greater than if they just embrace, with some checks and balances, some adjustments, if you will, and then embrace the innovation. I think that would be a relatively better outcome. So saying that differently, a lot of the rhetoric we hear about breakups and you know, all these big changes, these structural changes that we hear about, I really think that's low probability, and history also aligns with that. And there's examples. We can have our discussion just about that topic as well. Why we think that's a very small possibility, and highly unlikely to make any structural changes of that nature. Okay. Any more questions? Just add into the Q&A. If not, we can end early, a bit early here. So while we're waiting for some more questions to come through, there will be the next webinar that I'm going to be doing is our 2023 telecom predictions, and that's going to be out in February. And I would encourage everybody to attend that. We've got some really good predictions I think you guys are going to want to see, and some of the data that we have we'll be sharing on that webinar. February 9th, I believe, is the date for that, and there'll be invites sent out to everyone. The next question is,